we hear all this crap about outside the box thinking and blah, blah, blah. And the truth of the matter is, unlimited creativity, when it's wide open, usually gets you nowhere. Being creative inside the box is much more effective. The blend of the command and control and the super flexi, right? You do need some limits, right? And one of the things that's good with flow also is, and this doesn't happen in the super flexi environments, you need risk. Risk is another focusing mechanism, right? It drives attention. If anything goes and it doesn't really matter, right? There's no risk. There's not enough risk. You're not paying enough attention.
What does it take to do the impossible? What does it take to level up your game like never before? What does it take for individuals, organizations, for even institutions to achieve paradigm shifting? Nothing is ever the same again. Breakthroughs.
Our mission is to decode the neurobiology of flow and cognitive peak performance. Access the minds of maverick scientists, groundbreaking innovators, and world-leading experts to understand what it takes to achieve ultimate human performance, so you can feel your best, perform your best, and accomplish your boldest goals. I'm your host, Rian Doris, and together with best-selling author Stephen Kotler, I present to you Flow Research Collective Radio.
First of all, tell me about this. Tell me about that premise. How do you do the impossible? That's a great start.
I've always been, kind of obsessed with the question of how do we do the impossible? What's kind of the source code of ultimate human performance, all that sort of stuff. And I got really, I got lucky with my obsession. I came out of grad school with kind of like one marketable skill, right? I could put words together in a straight line. That was all I could do. So I became a freelance writer. And what I quickly discovered, and I don't think they tell you this in the brochures, and it's, they definitely didn't tell me it in journalism school, but being a freelance writer, it came with a superpower. I discovered I could call up pretty much anybody in the world. And as long as I said the words, "Hi, this is Stephen Kotler, I'm with the New York Times," they would tell me absolutely anything. Just anything I wanted to know. And what I wanted to know
was that superpower.
Right? What I wanted to know was, what does it take to do the impossible? And, it sort of bled into my books. In Abundance, Abundance was a lot of things, but it was about entrepreneurs and innovators trying to take on impossible challenges, right? How do you take on poverty or healthcare, education, that kind of thing. In Rise of Superman, it was a different thing. It was action and adventure sport athletes who in the past 25 years had accomplished more kind of impossible feats than anybody ever before in history. And then even in my latest book, Tomorrowland, right, it's about innovators, the people who turned science fiction, or what was science fiction in the 20th century, into science fact here in the 21st century. So these people kind of dreamed up the impossible and brought it into reality. This sort of even extended into the work I do with the Flow Genome Project, right? We study ultimate human performance. What does it take to be your best when it matters most? And we're all across the board, right? Fortune 500 companies, U.S. Special Forces, general public. And the cool part about all this is, doesn't really matter where you look, right? Doesn't matter what domain you're in every single one of these domains, and it's a giant bandwidth, right? We see underneath kind of ultimate human performance, when people are at their best and performing at their best, we see the same signature. So it turns out in all these fields, I was actually looking at the same thing, which was really nice, because it turns out my question actually had an answer.
What's the secret then? You said that there's this same core.
Yeah. So, as you mentioned I'm the co-founder and director of research for the Flow Genome Project. And what we see at the heart of ultimate human performance is this state of consciousness known as flow, right? You may call it runner's high or being in the zone. If you play basketball, it's being unconscious. If you're a stand-up comic, you call it the forever box, right? But whatever the terminology, flow defines an optimal state of consciousness where we feel our best and we perform our best, right? And we've all had this experience, right? Because more colloquial, it's any of those moments we get so focused on the task at hand, on what we're doing, that everything else just disappears, right? So the self disappears, time passes strangely. Sometimes it'll slow down, you get that freeze frame effect. Maybe any of you has been in a car crash. more frequently it speeds up, right? And 5 hours will pass by in 5 minutes.
Right.
And throughout, right, all aspects of performance, mental and physical, go through the roof. Flow is now, we now talk about flow. Researchers of today talk about flow as the source code of ultimate human performance, right? We know that pretty much any gold medal or world championship that's ever been won, we believe there's a flow state at its heart, because the state massively drives creativity and decision-making and things along those lines. We see it, responsible for major breakthroughs in science and technology, significant progress in the arts, in business, where we are. McKinsey did a 10-year study, and they found top executives are 5 times more productive in flow. So 5 times more productive is 500% more productive. Yeah. It means, right, go to work on Monday, spend Monday in a flow state, and you can take Tuesday through Friday off and get as much done as your steady state peers.
Wow, that is amazing. So you've taken this research, it seems like you've taken it from a very broad spectrum of places. Like you said, from athletes, from CEOs, whatever it may be, and it all boils down to the same thing, which is this flow state. And do you believe from that research that the flow state is accessible to anybody?
Yeah, so flow science stretches back about 150 years. In fact, some of the earliest experiments ever run in kind of what's become cognitive neuroscience or what was experimental psychology were run on flow, right? Mm-hmm. In the 60s and 70s and 80s, a guy named Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who was the chairman of the University of Chicago Psychology Department, did what is kind of still to this day, I believe, the largest optimal psych study ever run. Mm-hmm. And it was on flow, and he discovered a number of critical things. The first is the answer to your question, which is flow is ubiquitous. It shows up anywhere, anytime, provided certain initial conditions are met. So yes, everybody from kind of software coders in Mumbai to jazz musicians in Algeria to, believe it or not, and this was in his original study group, assembly line workers in Detroit and Chicago. So if you can get into flow, Navajo sheep herders, by the way, Italian grape farmers, elderly Korean women, Japanese teenage motorcycle gang members. I mean, when I say he talked to everybody, he talked to everybody.
I guess.
And so, if I always say, look, if you can get into flow on an assembly line, when I was in high school, I worked in a factory, and it's miserable. It's the most miserable thing I ever did. And
sure.
if you can get into flow working in a factory on an assembly line, you can get into flow doing anything.
That's like I said, I find that amazing. I mean, I think, but flow, and I know that you understand this. Flow seems to be, in the way that you're describing it, seems to be this elusive thing. It's like I was really in that place. I was in the flow of it all, and it was all happening. But shit, I don't know how I got there, and I got to wait for this great moment of inspiration or the muse, and then suddenly I'll be back in it. But it seems like what you're telling me, I'm guessing here, is that you've kind of broken it down into a science, and these are the steps.
So what couple things changed. First thing that changed is, and you know this because you know how fast technology is accelerating. Starting in the early 90s, neuroscience, biotechnology, et cetera, they started accelerating wildly, right? Yes. Biotechnology, for example, is currently moving at 5 times the speed of Moore's law. So it's literally doubling in power every 4 months, right? And this is impacting everything. Let me give you just one random example because it still blows my mind. I heard Fareed Zakaria say this the other day. Every day you're alive, because of what is happening in biotechnology, you gain 5 hours of life expectancy, no exercise required. It's moving that fast.
Wow.
That's insane, I know. So it started driving neuroimaging and brain science forward, where we can peer deeper inside the brain than ever before.
Yes.
So what happened was, as you pointed out, up to this point, flow had been like lightning in a bottle. In fact, for the first 50 years we were looking at it, right, from like the 1870s until the 1950s, people didn't even know it was a separate, they thought it was a mystical experience, right? Literally, quote unquote.
Yeah,
it wasn't until Abraham Maslow in the 50s came along and he had this huge study group, all of atheists, and they kept reporting flow. That was the first time anybody went, hey, wait a minute, maybe this isn't spiritual or mystical or religious, maybe it's just normal people, right?
Right.
So, as you pointed out, it was mystified, it was weird, but we've looked under the hood. We now know, as a general rule, what's causing flow. We know, there are radical changes in normal brain function that occur during flow. We understand what those are. when you couple that, so this is why I worked on action and adventure sport athletes. One of the problems with flow was subjective, right? If I want to know if you were in flow, I had to give you this subjective questionnaire. It was extremely well validated, great study, fantastic, but it was subjective. The goal of science is objectivity, right? It has to be. So what happened over the past 25 years in action and adventure sports is these men and women have gotten so good at what they're doing, and the level of performance has gone up so much that if they're actually not in flow when they're performing, they're going home in a body bag or they're going to the hospital. And this gave us something incredible. It was a hard data set with which to work. These folks survived. If they lived to tell the tale, they were in flow. So we could take that, couple with the neuroscience, and work backwards to what we call our flow triggers.
That's a pretty hard consequence.
It's a really hard consequence. And, I've been in and around action and adventure sports for a very long time. There's a reason I chose to work on it. And, we've lost a lot of people. I've lost a lot of friends. Dean Potter, who was on our board at the Flow Genome Project, passed away, a few months ago. So, yes, the consequences are very, very severe and very sad. But on the flip side, it gave us data, and we could work backwards to these flow triggers. And we've discovered 18 flow triggers. So these are preconditions that lead to more flow, and that anybody can apply them, right? It's obviously, we worked on action adventure sport athletes, but that was just where to get them. Anybody can apply them in all walks of life. And it's sort of like your flow toolkit, right? You want more flow in your life? You don't have to use all 18. You can use 1, 5, and 7, or 3, 6. It doesn't really matter. You can take your pick. But by applying these things, and it's still, let's be clear, it's a state of consciousness. It's not a light switch, right? We don't have flow in a pill. And by the way, for anybody who has seen Limitless and wants their NZ40, right, we're nowhere close. I mean, we're years away.
I'm putting my hand up. I'll take a large order, please.
Leslie Dixon, who wrote Limitless, is a friend of mine.
Oh, really?
And every time I see her, I yell at her. I'm like, you have any idea how hard you have made my life? People come up to me. They're like, where's my Limitless flow pill? And
Absolutely.
We're nowhere close.
Damn.
So can't work it like a light switch.
Right.
But what we are seeing, just, in our classes alone, on average, people are reporting after like 6 weeks of training with this information, these triggers and whatever, and not full-time, part-time, people have lives and whatever. They're reporting a 5-fold increase in flow and a 5-fold increase in creativity and a 3-fold increase in self-confidence. These are coming through our trainings. Other people have other trainings. They're getting results that are, good as well. Ours seem to be really, really solid, and we're really, really, happy with it. So yes, this stuff is totally trainable. You want more flow in your lives? It's readily available. Not easy, but it's readily available.
Give us a couple, Stephen. So somebody can go away and watch this, listen to this, and go, okay, I'm going to do this one thing, and just to, if they can get a sense of it. I mean, it's kind of like, I think, a taster, if you will.
I'll give you a couple, because so the first thing you need to know, flow takes place when all of our attention is focused in the current moment, right? So all these so-called triggers are simply ways of focusing attention in the now. If you want to put this in a bigger scientific concept, these are the 18 things that evolution shaped your brain to pay the most attention to. So essentially, when you're hacking flow, you're making evolutionary biology work for you. That's all you're doing. Now, that said, before we get in, this is not like self-help. Self-help makes you 5% better, 10% better if you're lucky, and nothing bad's going to happen if you screw up.
Right.
With flow, you're playing with fundamental evolutionary biology. From a biological standpoint, very addictive neurochemistry. You have to be careful. You have to know what you're doing, right? We always tell people if they would come to us with serious emotional problems, solve those first, then do this stuff. We'll just screw you up, right? So that's the caveat coming in. That said, the first trigger is the most obvious. And I want to mention it because it's a business show. People have been talking about passion endlessly for the past 10, 15 years. Passion is one of these crazy words that everybody mystifies. It means all kinds of things. Passion is a flow trigger simply for one reason. We pay more attention to the stuff we believe in. Right. Passion is important for performance because it focuses attention. So across the boards, being passionate about what it is that you're doing is important. Right. But what I want to talk about is what's called the golden rule of flow. And this was not our discovery. This is Csikszentmihalyi. It was a flow trigger he discovered back in the 60s and 70s. but it is still kind of the most fundamental, basic, and almost everything comes from this. So the idea is that flow exists sort of between the midpoint between anxiety, hey, there's not enough stimulation here, I don't care, and boredom, or boredom, hey, there's not enough stimulation, anxiety, way too much stimulation, I care too much, right? So in between, there's a sweet spot, it's called the flow channel. What it means is that the challenge of the task at hand slightly, and slightly is the key word here, exceeds your skill set. So you want to stretch, but not snap. Now, this is tricky for two groups of people. If you are not a type A personality, not a hard-charging, super high performer, right? This sweet spot is the point at which you get uncomfortable, right? So if you're going to hack flow, produce more flow in your life, you're going to have to take risks. You're going to have to push yourself outside your comfort zone, right? Now, the flip side, which is a much bigger problem we find for kind of type A's, top executives, that sort of stuff, is it's actually you want to stretch but not snap. It's a small amount of pushing, and type A types, myself included, I will bypass this sweet spot without even noticing. I will take on challenges that are 20% greater, 50% greater, 70% greater than where I should be. And I'll deny myself the massive uptick in performance that I would need to accomplish those things, right, along the way. So I'm not saying don't set giant, big goals, but chunk them down into such a way that the goal is every day you want to wake up and you want to push hard, but not too hard, right? Yeah. So what's tricky about it is it requires endless amounts of grit over and over and over again. You have to be gritty every day. You have to be willing to step up to the challenge every day. And as you know, you do that for 5 years, it's exhausting, it's hard, right? You need flow, by the way, as the reprieve. If you weren't getting the flow, as a payoff, I don't think anybody would keep going on this path. They would be miserable, right? And this brings me to an important point. Flow, one of the things we know about flow, and this chick sent me how I figured this out, and this has been extremely well validated, is that the people who score, it's often said that the people who have the most flow in their lives are the happiest people on earth. It's actually not entirely true. The people who have the most flow in their lives score off the charts on overall well-being and life satisfaction, and it's different, right? Happiness is a thin slice measure of how do you feel right now. Overall well-being, life satisfaction, that's a thicker meaning and purpose. And the reason it matters is if you're constantly challenging yourself all the time, right? Yeah. You're not always happy. Let's talk about one more trigger. And let me give you a couple examples of how it gets applied in business because it'll be useful. So one of the things that we know triggers flow, and this is one of the things that actually showed up in the action adventure sport athletes, it's one of the things we learned from them, is they perform in what are called rich environments. These are environments that are packed with novelty, complexity, and unpredictability. So a rich environment is another one of flow's triggers. And the reason is, anytime there's novelty, complexity, and unpredictability, right, the brain loves this. We pay the most attention to these conditions, right? Robert Sapolsky at Stanford says the brain loves maybe, right? Nothing is more addictive than maybe to the brain. So let me give you one. This is kind of one of my favorite examples of the kind of how of the rich environment trigger applied in business. There's actually two. I'll give you one from Steve Jobs, and this was he changed an environment. So when he was building Pixar, right, the famous movie studio, he had this problem that nobody was talking to one another. He had marketing over here in the old building, and the editors were over there, and the animators were, and nobody. So ideas weren't bumping into each other. It was stifling creativity. There wasn't enough novelty, complexity, unpredictability. There was not enough flow. So when he built the new version of Pixar, right, he designed a giant atrium and put it in the center of the building. Trickily, he put all the mailboxes, the meeting rooms, the only bathrooms in the whole place, right by the atrium. So everybody had to come together in the atrium to do anything. Right. Massively increased novelty, complexity, and unpredictability. The result was a tremendous amount more flow and a tremendous amount more creativity as a result. So that's one example. That's how the physical environment can change. Here's another example, and this is probably my favorite. It's from Facebook. Facebook has a program called Hack a Month. What it means is that if you've worked at Facebook for over a year, you can choose to leave your department and jump to any department in the company for a month. You can hack a month.
Okay.
Hack a month, right?
Wow.
And if you like it afterwards, you can petition them to stay, right? So what does this do? It massively increases novelty, complexity, and unpredictability. And when you look under the hood, right, you would think, hey, you've been working in marketing for 10 years, you're going to jump over to kind of animation for a month. You're not going to actually make much of a contribution. But it turns out there's so much flow that results, and flow so improves mental performance that people who are showing up for a month are making big contributions, right? So there's two different examples for you. One way how you can kind of change a facility around to take advantage of this trigger. Here's another way to kind of, it's lateralization, right? We all have this experience. Awe. Awe is what happens when we encounter overwhelming complexity, right? You look up at the night sky and suddenly you realize that all those stars are actually galaxies, and oh my God, look at all that potential light, whatever, right? And you get sucked in, right? Reality seems to freeze, so time passes strangely. It sort of gets sucked into that moment. It only lasts a few seconds, but awe is sort of like the front end of a flow state experience. It's what happens when you very quickly pull that novelty, complexity, and that rich environment trigger, you get thrown in. And if you look under the surface, it's neurobiological. You're releasing dopamine. When we encounter novelty, right, we get dopamine. Dopamine, among many other things, is a focusing chemical. It drives attention. It's a pleasure drug, right, but it really focuses attention.
What's the way to make sure you're not in the flow? Because I think people are very good at not being in the flow.
Well, so, there's a lot of them, but I mean, today you got to start with the obvious, which is multitasking is a stupid idea. We're bad at it, right? We can't do it. Like study after study after study after study tells us we cannot do it, right? I'm a writer. I start my day at 4 o'clock in the morning to write. Why do I start at 4 o'clock in the morning? Because nobody's calling me, because my email is turned off, because my cell phone is turned off, because my wife doesn't need me, because the dogs aren't awake, all that stuff. It's uninterrupted concentration, right?
Yeah.
When it's interesting, a couple years ago, Csikszentmihalyi and a University of Utah researcher named Kevin Rathunde, when looking for the highest flow environments they could find outside of action adventure sports, one of the things they found was Montessori education. And one of the reasons is Montessori education is built around these uninterrupted, usually 90 minutes, sometimes 120 minutes, periods of uninterrupted concentration, right? They're intrinsically motivated. You study whatever's interesting to you at the time, but you do it for 90 minutes straight, no interruptions.
Yeah.
It's a big deal, right? It's a big deal. There's study after study now shows that interruptions that move us out of flow, that anything that kicks us out, if we can get back in at all, it takes at least 15 to 21 minutes to get back in, right? So, one of the things we always say, when we're training people up in this stuff is have your conversations out loud. Tell your boss, tell your wife, tell whoever that this is what you're doing. Nobody is going to begrudge you a state that makes you 500% more productive and 700% more creative and amplifies learning, blah, 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 right? They're going to give it to you. It's good for business. It's good for relationships. It's good for everything. But you gotta shut the door and put the do not disturb sign in front. And I know it's not a really sexy thing to say, but it's really true.
The dichotomy of leadership, and that old style leadership, as I'm sure you're aware, was command and control, very rigid, very stiff. And because my background is in psychology, the mind loves to polarize. And the polarity of that is, oh my God, that doesn't work. So now we're just going to let everybody do whatever they want. And that doesn't work. And one of the things I talk about is this dichotomy between the rigid and the flexible. And I believe that the best state of leadership is the blend of the two. Is how do you bring those two things together? And I'm hearing a sense of that in what you're saying.
Well, so let me give you same similar concept applies with creativity, right? Mm-hmm. Creativity is another flow trigger. And what I mean by that is underneath creativity, there's a lot going on. But one of the things there is pattern recognition. When you connect two ideas together, when you connect ideas together, right, you filled out a crossword puzzle, that little rush of pleasure when you get an answer right, that's dopamine again, right? So pattern recognition, right, blah, blah, triggers dopamine. So one of the things about creativity is we hear all this crap about outside the box thinking and blah, blah, blah. And the truth of the matter is unlimited creativity, when it's wide open, usually gets you nowhere. Being creative inside the box is much more effective. Mm-hmm. The blend of the command and control and the super flexi, right? You do need some limits, right? And one of the things that's good with flow also is, and this doesn't happen in the super flexy environments, you need risk. Risk is another focusing mechanism, right? It drives attention. If anything goes and it doesn't really matter, right? There's no risk. There's not enough risk. You're not paying enough attention, right? So I agree with you. I think there is there's some kind of management style in between. I mean, at the Flow Genome Project, our philosophy is hire the best 1% and then get the hell out of it. Give them exactly what they're doing and then get the hell out of the way.
Yeah.
Right? Set the goals, hire the right people, set the goals you want, and then get out of the way.
Well, as Branson said, there's no point in hiring smart people and then telling them what to do.
Exactly.
So it's really...
Well, the other thing is, you want to hire the most creative people you possibly can. And as a creative person, if you tell us exactly what to do and don't give, why are you bothering to hire the most creative people if you're going to tell them what to do? It doesn't make any sense.
No, exactly. And I think that, like I said, I think it's this blend between the two places. Like, you don't want to be this wishy-washy leader who's saying, well, we're kind of working in this area, see what you can do, who also flip-flops their opinion all the time. And you also can't afford to be that rigid that you're not letting people breathe or step into their flow or into their creativity. And those two things coming together, to me, just seems like the most elegant form of leadership, because it takes a lot of fierceness, like this is what we do, this is what we're about, this is the outcome we're driving to, because this is what matters to us. How you get there is up to you. We believe in your skills, your talents, stepping into that.
I don't know if you see this, but one of the things we say at the Flow Genome Project also is we like to hire, if we can, out of the people with action sports backgrounds. And the thinking is, the action sport athletes can do two things, for sure. They can execute, because if you don't execute in the backcountry, you're going to die. Right. And when stuff goes crazy, they get calm. Because if you don't, people are going to die, right? And what I find today, and I'm sure you've seen the same thing, is that these days, everybody wants to be an idea guy. Oh, I've got millions of ideas. I'm an idea guy. Let me just be creative. Nobody can execute. People are terrible at executing. So I think, one of the things that I agree with everything you're saying about leadership, but you also have to hire people who know how to execute. Because
absolutely,
that's what's back when you and I grew up. There was a lot of creativity missing. If you walked into a meeting and said, this company has to be more passionate, more creative, we got to love what we do more, and we have to be socially conscious along the way, you would have been laughed out of the room,
Go
right?
Find another job.
Exactly. It would have never happened, right? So the fact that now we can talk about passion and purpose and like these things actually mean something in the business context, which is fantastic, great improvement. But what we've gone to, as you said, to the other extreme, doesn't seem like people can get the job done anymore.
No, that's why you get the two things together.
We have this problem, I've seen this over and over and over again, it's this, I've got lots of ideas. Execute, goddammit. One of the other big deals about flow is motivation is a huge problem today, right? Gallup just did a survey. 71% of American workers are disengaged or actively disengaged on the job, right? And actively disengaged, it's my favorite euphemism ever. It means this job sucks so much, I'm going to go out of my way to sabotage the company, right? So 3 out of 4 of us hate what we do with the majority of our time. But the other 29%, most of them have jobs that produce flow, right? They come to work early, they stay like they're ideal employees. Flow cocktails 5 of the most potent feel-good neurochemicals the brain can produce, right? It's just about the most addictive state on earth, or, we don't like the term addictive, so we call it the source code of intrinsic motivation, whatever. But it means that once something starts
what it means is hit me up, I'm having a great time.
Right, hit me again, please. Right, that's what it means.
Exactly. Not that I'm addicted, but this will anytime now.
No, and look, we've all seen this, right? Software coding is something that requires a tremendous amount of flow to do well, right? And when the coders stay up like 5 days straight to finish a piece of software, it is not the warm beer and cold pizza that is driving them forward, right?
No,
it's that
definitely not.
coding produces flow, and they can't wait to get more of it.
Well, tell us a little bit more about I think your latest book is called Tomorrowland, which, when I remember seeing the title of it, I think you and I were talking about before, that I went, I saw that Disney movie, and I really thought initially when I saw it, this is the book about the movie. It's the screenplay turned into a book. But of course, it's not. And you were telling me that. So tell us a little bit about Tomorrowland. And,
Actually, the movie would have been based on my book. The movie wouldn't have flopped. It would have been fine. The book is about the transformation of science fiction into science fact. More specifically, it's about the massively transformative and disruptive impact that transformation is having on culture, right? So I came up as a journalist. That's where we started, right? And in the mid-'90s, it was actually, you mentioned Peter Diamandis. So the first time I met Peter, right? We met in this diner in Chinatown in San Francisco, and we're sitting there, and Peter had his back to the whole restaurant. And there were like 25 people in the restaurant, and I could see the whole restaurant. He couldn't see anybody. And he, it's Peter, and he's getting very excited. He's telling some maverick outsider is going to take down NASA. We're going to have screaming about how we're going to have private spaceships within, 10 years. And the whole restaurant is looking at him like he's out of his mind, right? But I'm looking at him like, you know what? I think this is for real. I had just spent a month doing a bunch of rocket science stories. Everybody I met had said, look, NASA may say this is impossible. Aerospace may say this is impossible, but this can happen. We can do this. And here was Peter about to make it happen with the X Prize.
Yeah.
And I was like, holy crap, this is a science fiction idea. It's about to go science fact. And it blew my mind. And I went home after that conversation. I made a list of like 25 things or whatever that were the big science fiction ideas of the 20th century, right? Flying cars, terraforming, whatever. And I kept track of them. And it became my beat as a journalist. It was one of the things that I covered. So every time science fiction became science fact, I was there. I was in the room or, at the launch as far as the X Prize goes and whatever.
Right.
And, it got to a point where I had finished Bold and I was looking at all these stories and I had never read them all together, like all these various things. And I read them back to back sort of, and I was like, holy crap, it's this astoundingly crazy picture of the future that it even blew my mind. And I wrote the stories, but when you looked at it in an aggregate, it was like, it just blew my mind. So I sort of rewrote them and tuned them all so they fit together in one book. And that's what it is. So besides being a look at where we're coming from and where we're going and kind of the massively disruptive impact it's having on culture, which is very true. It's also a look at kind of the men and the women who invented tomorrow, right? I mean, it's really interesting because let's just say that none of them came from the mainstream, right?
Right.
The future was not invented by normal America or normal anybody, right? For that matter, normal North, normal anything. These are wild, wild people with wild backgrounds as a general rule. And it's, the other thing that I talk about, it's really, we think about, the future, science, like history, it's written by the victors, right? So you don't realize that inventing the future is actually a war, like how difficult it really is, because we hear about the victories. We don't hear about the war very much. So this also kind of looks at the battle to invent the future. My first book took me 11 years. I started over from scratch 4 different times where I took the 800-page manuscript and threw it out, right? And every one of those books is famous for rewriting, in fact, the current book that I'm writing, I have been working 6 months on the first 3 chapters, just trying to get them right. And they were crap. And we 3 weeks ago, I threw them all out again and I had to call my editor. I was like, I'm going to be late. There's no way, because it's crap. It's just shit. I'm starting over. Nope, you got to be willing to do it. You've got to love that. Yeah. Right? I remember, funny story about speaking, and this I also think is one of the reasons a lot of writers have problems. My first book came out, and I had got a great, wonderful Jewish mother, and I flew to Cleveland, where she was, to give my very first talk ever, my first public talk as an author. It was in a bookstore, and it was a blizzard. It was the winter. It was Cleveland. There was so much snow on the ground. And, it's my mom, and she's a great Jewish mother. She rallies 150 of her friends to drive through a blizzard and packs this bookstore for me. And I get up there, and I'm reading, and I'm doing my reading, and I look up, and I realize I am boring the ever-living shit out of and people are falling asleep, right? They've driven through a blizzard, and I'm putting them to sleep. And it was at that moment I was like, holy crap, this is my job too. Yes. It doesn't matter that I had to write the books. like, this is my job too. And it took, it took me 10 years to figure out how to be really good on stage, and another, 10 years to figure out how do you do radio. Television is 3 times as fast as radio, which is 3 times as fast as radio. Like, these are hard skills that if you want these careers, like, I had to, all the PR side of being a writer, it's a whole other career. I mean, it's not like it's, I've got my 8-hour day as a writer, and then I got another one on top of it to support my business. Yeah. And that's just what it is. I got my ass kicked on radio for a while before I got it down. I got my ass kicked on television. Luckily, it was like, Good Morning San Diego, and like 3 people saw it. You know what I mean? Like, it wasn't anything major, thank God. But like, yeah, you get your butt kicked on that stuff for a long time. It's a totally different skill. What I love about all this stuff is, as a flow guy, right? I want to challenge myself. Like, I love those challenges. And I don't like being bad at things. I mean, I really don't like being bad at things. I'm kind of that way myself. So if there's anything I have to do in my life that's important, I have to learn how to be good at it, because, I'm so thin-skinned that being bad at things, I don't take that well. Risk is a flow trigger, and people always think, well, you're talking about physical risk because you work with action sport athletes. And I said, no. Like, you need risk, right? It's a trigger, but you can, social risk, emotional risk, spiritual, it doesn't matter. It's social risk. Your brain, with your psychology background, you probably know this, your brain can't tell the difference between physical risk and social risk, right? No. Fear of public speaking is the #1 fear in the world, not like fear of getting eaten by a saber-toothed tiger, which from an evolutionary standpoint, you would believe. But, the reason is, until about 350 years ago, if you screwed up socially and got exiled, kicked out, it was a capital crime. It was a death sentence, right? So the brain can't tell the difference. So when you walk up on stage, you're terrified. It doesn't, because there's always that part of your brain, and I like that. I'm really happy in those rooms. I just did a speech last week for Gartner Research, and at a really big room, lots of people, big stage, and 4 minutes before I go on, they're like, oh yeah, we asked you for a 40-minute speech, but can you actually go an hour? And I was like, sure. I had no slides, and I just had to wing 20 minutes in the middle of it, which, not a particularly big deal, but I used it as fuel. I was like, in my seat, like trying to churn up a little more energy because I wanted the risk. Yeah. So anything about me, Stephen Kotler, KOTLER.com. And if you go there, you can get a free PDF on flow and performance that will break down all 18 of the flow triggers that we've been talking about today. Fabulous. Actually, it'll break out 17. We don't talk about passion, which is a meta trigger. Don't worry about it. But give you plenty to be dangerous with. And then if you go to the flowgenomeproject.com, that's everything you want about flow. And if you go there, there's a free flow diagnostic. Different people are susceptible to different triggers, and this will tell you which direction in your life you kind of want to lean in. So those resources are there. There's tons of videos, free videos, and whatever.
If what you've heard on Flow Research Collective Radio has been helpful, please consider doing us a solid and leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you are listening to this. Reviews help us connect to a wider audience so we can get these peak performance principles out to more people.